Benjamin Franklin. In 1948, the 20th Century Limited was the most luxurious train in the world. There's something honest about a train. It's a machine that only knows one direction: forward. It doesn't care about your past, and it certainly doesn't care if you have a future. In 1948, the 20th Century Limited was the peak of civilization. 65 tons of rolling steel, velvet, and mahogany, connecting New York to Chicago in a heartbeat. But civilization is just a thin coat of paint, and on this trip, the paint was about to start peeling. The rain was lashing against the windows of Grand Central Terminal like a desperate hitchhiker. Silas Thorne stood on the platform, his trench coat soaked through, watching the elite of Manhattan board the train of tycoons. Silas wasn't an elite. He was a private investigator with a hole in his shoe and a .38 Special tucked into his shoulder holster. He had been hired by a terrified socialite to watch her husband, a man who had more debts than friends. But the moment Silas stepped onto that famous red carpet leading to the boarding gate, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It wasn't the husband he was worried about. It was the air. It felt heavy, charged with a static that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Ticket, please," the conductor chirped, his smile as stiff as his starched collar. Silas handed over his crumpled slip. As he walked down the narrow paneled hallway of the sleeper car, the train lurched. The iron wheels ground against the tracks, and the journey began. 16 hours to Chicago. 16 hours of isolation at 80 miles per hour. By the time the train cleared the city limits, the luxury of the dining car was in full swing. Crystal glasses clinked, and the scent of expensive steaks filled the air. But in the kitchen, something was wrong. A young steward named Leo was reaching for a bottle of Bordeaux in the storage locker when he felt a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't a draft. It was a coldness that felt intentional. He turned around, expecting to see the head chef. Instead, he saw a shadow. It was tall, draped in a heavy, grease-stained leather apron that looked out of place in this temple of wealth. The figure didn't have a face, only a pair of goggles that reflected the flickering light of the train's lamps. Leo didn't even have time to scream. A flash of polished steel, a long, heavy cleaver used for breaking down beef carcasses, sliced through the steam of the kitchen. Silence followed. Only the rhythmic click-clack of the wheels remained, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that would soon be the only witness to the carnage. Silas sat in the club car, lighting a lucky strike. He watched the dark woods of upstate New York blur past the window. He noticed a small, dark stain spreading across the white tablecloth of an empty booth nearby. He leaned closer. It wasn't wine. It was thick, dark, and still warm. "Conductor?" Silas called out, his voice low and steady. No one answered. The steward who had been serving drinks minutes ago was gone. The lounge was empty, save for the hum of the engine and the growing sense that the 20th Century Limited had just become a coffin with an engine. In a moving train, sounds become a language. The groan of the couplings, the whistle of the wind through the window cracks, the steady, rhythmic thump-thump of the tracks. But when you've spent enough time in the dark corners of the world, you learn to hear the one sound that doesn't belong. The wet, heavy slide of something being dragged across a carpeted floor. Silas Thorne stared at the dark stain on the tablecloth. He dipped his finger into the liquid. It was viscous, holding the heat of a body that had been alive less than 5 minutes ago. He looked around the club car, the luxury of the Art Deco interior, the chrome railings, the plush blue velvet chairs, now felt like the inside of a polished rib cage. "Check, please," Silas muttered to the empty room. He stood up, his hand reflexively hovering near the opening of his trench coat, where the cold grip of his .38 waited. He headed toward the service galley. The swinging doors were still oscillating slightly, as if someone had just passed through. The kitchen of the 20th Century Limited was a masterpiece of compact engineering, but now it was a scene from a slaughterhouse. The smell of roasted prime rib was gone, replaced by the overwhelming copper stench of fresh blood. Silas stepped over a pile of broken porcelain. There, slumped against the industrial refrigerator, was the head chef. He had been hung by a meat hook through the jaw. His white apron turned a jagged, sickening crimson. There was no struggle, no signs of a fight. Just the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly where the bone ended and the muscle began. "Sweet Jesus," Silas breathed, the air in the galley feeling thin and freezing. He moved back into the passenger corridor, his boots clicking rhythmically on the narrow wooden floorboards. He needed to find the conductor, or better yet, the brake lever. But the 20th Century didn't just stop. It was a juggernaut of momentum. He reached the first sleeper car, the Imperial Forest. Here, the elite were tucked away behind heavy mahogany doors. Silas began to knock, softly at first, then with the frantic urgency of a man who knows the Reaper is in the hallway. The first door to open belonged to Evelyn St. Clair. She was the kind of woman who looked like she'd been born in a spotlight. Platinum blonde hair, a silk robe the color of a bruised plum, and eyes that had seen too many gin fizzes and not enough sunsets. "Detective Thorne, is there a reason you're waking the dead?" she asked, her voice a sultry rasp. Then she saw the look on his face and the crimson smear on his cuff. Her hand went to her throat. "Silas, what happened?" "Stay inside, Evelyn. Lock the door and don't open it unless you hear my voice, and only my voice," Silas hissed. "There's a wolf on this train, and he's already started on the sheep." Silas moved to the next cabin. He found the conductor's station, but the man was gone. On the small desk sat a logbook, its pages fluttering in the draft. The last entry was written in a shaky hand. "Passenger in compartment 7B. Something is wrong with his luggage. It's leaking." Silas turned toward compartment 7B. The hallway felt longer now, the shadows stretching and warping with every jolt of the train. He reached the door. It was slightly ajar. He kicked it open, his revolver drawn and steady. The cabin was empty of life, but full of trophies. Nailed to the mahogany walls were the personal belongings of the missing stewards. A gold watch, a pair of blood-stained spectacles, a singed bow tie. And in the center of the bed sat a large, heavy leather trunk. It was old, reinforced with iron bands, and a dark, sticky trail was indeed seeping from the bottom, soaking into the expensive Persian rug. Silas approached the trunk. The train took a sharp curve, and the heavy metal latch of the trunk jiggled. Clink, clink. He reached out, flipped the latch, and pushed the lid back. It wasn't a body. It was a collection of knives, dozens of them. Bone saws, skinning blades, heavy-duty cleavers, and long, thin filleting knives, all polished to a mirror finish. And resting on top was a note, written on the official stationery of the New York Central Railroad. "The feast has begun. I've saved the heart of the train for you, detective." Suddenly, the lights in the corridor flickered and died. The hum of the generator was replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very floorboards. Silas spun around, the moonlight through the windows casting long, strobing bars of silver and black across the hallway. At the far end of the car, silhouetted against the frosted glass of the observation door, stood the butcher. He looked immense, a mountain of dark leather and cold intent. In his right hand, he held a heavy meat mallet. In his left, a long, serrated blade that caught the moon's light like a jagged tooth. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply began to walk, his heavy boots creating a counterbeat to the rhythm of the train. Click-clack, thump, click-clack, thump. "End of the line, Thorne," a voice rasped from behind the butcher's mask, a voice that sounded like grinding stones. Silas fired. The roar of the .38 filled the narrow hallway. The muzzle flashed blinding for a split second. The bullet hit the butcher square in the chest, but the figure didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He just kept coming, a mechanical force of nature that didn't know how to stop. Silas realized then that he wasn't hunting a man. There is a point where speed stops feeling like progress and starts feeling like a death sentence. The 20th Century Limited was designed to be the fastest thing on rails, but now, that speed was an enemy. The train wasn't just moving, it was screaming. The engine had been bypassed, the throttles pinned to the firewall by a dead man's hand, and we were hurtling toward the tight curves of the Hudson Valley at 90 miles per hour. Silas Thorne backed away from the silhouette of the butcher, the smoke from his .38 still curling in the air. The man, if it was a man, didn't stop. The bullet had torn through his leather apron, but the butcher moved with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a piston. "Evelyn, get out of here, now!" Silas roared, grabbing the woman by the arm and dragging her toward the heavy sliding door of the next car. They burst into the baggage car, a cavernous space filled with the trunks of the wealthy and the crates of the powerful. It was a labyrinth of shadows. The train slammed into a slight curve, and the entire car leaned violently to the left. Trunks shifted with a thunderous boom, nearly crushing Silas's leg. "Why isn't he stopping, Silas?" Evelyn gasped, her silk robe torn, her eyes darting toward every dark corner. "You hit him. I saw the spark." "He's wearing a vest, or he's too dead to care," Silas growled, reloading his revolver with shaking fingers. "He's not here for the money, Evelyn. He's here for the harvest." From the darkness between two massive wardrobe trunks, a sound emerged. A slow, rhythmic scraping. Scree. The butcher was dragging his cleaver along the corrugated steel walls of the car. It was a psychological serration, a sound designed to peel the nerves right off the bone. "I know you, Thorne," the rasping voice echoed, seemingly from everywhere at once. "I remember you from the stockyards in '39. You were the cop who didn't look too closely at the accidents in the rendering plant. You let the blood wash down the drain because the owners paid you in gold. Now, the drain is plugged, and the blood is backing up." Silas froze. The past, the one thing a noir detective can never outrun, had just caught up with him at 90 miles per hour. "I did my job," Silas yelled into the dark. "Your job was to keep the machinery greased," the butcher hissed. Suddenly, a crate to their right exploded. The butcher didn't walk this time. He lunged. He swung a heavy iron meat hook attached to a chain. It whistled through the air, catching Silas in the shoulder. The metal tore through his wool coat and bit deep into the muscle. Silas screamed, his revolver skittering across the floor. Evelyn didn't scream. She grabbed a heavy brass fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with the desperation of a cornered animal. It caught the butcher across the side of his head, cracking his goggles. He stumbled back, a low, guttural growl escaping his mask. "Run!" Silas choked out, clutching his bloody shoulder. They scrambled through the coupling, the freezing night air whipping between the cars like a blade. They reached the tender, the car carrying the coal for the massive steam engine. The heat was immense, a roaring furnace of orange flame that illuminated the coal dust dancing in the air. Silas looked through the small glass portal into the engineer's cab. His heart sank. The engineer and the firemen were there, but they weren't driving. They had been processed. Their bodies were propped up in their seats, their hands stitched to the controls with heavy industrial wire. They looked like macabre puppets steering a ghost ship. And the pressure gauge was deep in the red zone. The needle was vibrating, threatening to snap. "The boiler is going to blow," Silas whispered. "If we don't hit the brakes, this whole train is going to become a fireball." "Then hit them," Evelyn cried. "I can't reach the cab. The butcher jammed the hatch from the inside." Silas looked back. The butcher was standing at the edge of the coal pile, silhouetted against the dark, rushing landscape outside. He was covered in coal dust, looking like a demon birthed from the engine itself. He held the long, serrated blade high, the firelight reflecting off the steel. "The cycle must be completed, Detective," the butcher said, stepping onto the shifting coal. "The fire needs a sacrifice to stay hot. The 20th century demands its due." The train took another curve, sharper this time. The wheels shrieked in agony as they fought the centrifugal force. The car tilted so far that coal began to spill out into the night. Silas found his footing, his hand closing around a heavy coal shovel. "You want a sacrifice?" Silas spat, blood dripping from his hand onto the black coal. "Come and take it, but I'm not going into the furnace alone." The butcher roared, a sound that drowned out the engine's whistle, and charged. They say that at the moment of death, your life flashes before your eyes. But for a man like Silas Thorne, it wasn't his life that flashed. It was his sins. The faces of the men he'd let slide into the rendering vats in Chicago, the grease-stained envelopes full of silence money, and the cold, mechanical indifference of a city that grinds people into meat. The 20th Century Limited was no longer a train. It was a purgatory on wheels, screaming through the night toward a final judgment. The butcher stood atop the coal pile, a titan of shadow and blood. The roaring fire from the open furnace door cast his silhouette against the rushing steam, making him look like an ancient god of the forge. He swung the heavy cleaver, and Silas barely parried the blow with the thick iron shaft of the coal shovel. The vibration jarred Silas's teeth. His wounded shoulder screamed in agony, but the adrenaline, that bitter copper-tasting fuel of the desperate, kept him upright. "You can't stop the machine, Thorne," the butcher roared over the thunder of the tracks. "The tracks were laid in bone. The steel was tempered in sweat. I am just the inevitable conclusion." "You're just a man with a knife and a grudge," Silas spat, lunging forward. He drove the tip of the shovel into the butcher's midsection. It hit something hard, the heavy leather apron, but the force pushed the giant back toward the edge of the tender. Evelyn screamed as the train hit a massive switch, the entire car lurching so violently that for a second, the left side wheels left the tracks. The butcher lost his footing, his heavy boots sliding on the slick coal. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung the shovel like a baseball bat, catching the butcher across his masked face. The glass of the goggles shattered, and the leather mask tore away. Silas froze. The face underneath wasn't a monster's. It was a face Silas knew. It was Arthur Miller, the night watchman from the Chicago stockyards 10 years ago. A man whose son had disappeared into the machinery on Silas's watch. A man Silas had told to take the money and keep quiet. "Arthur," Silas whispered. "There is no Arthur," the man shrieked, his eyes milky with madness and cataracts. "There is only the butcher, and the butcher is hungry." Arthur lunged, burying a long skinning knife deep into Silas's side. Silas gasped, the world turning gray at the edges. But as he fell, his hand found the heavy iron lever that coupled the tender to the passenger cars. "Evelyn, jump to the next car, now!" Silas choked out. "Silas, no! Do it!" As Evelyn leaped across the shifting, grinding gap between the cars, Silas pulled the pin. With a shriek of protesting metal that sounded like a dying god, the 20th Century Limited split in two. The engine and the tender, freed from the weight of the 16 passenger cars, surged forward like a released arrow. The passenger cars, now disconnected from the power of the steam, began to slow down, their emergency air brakes screaming as they bit into the rails. But Silas was still on the tender, with the butcher. "We're going into the river, Arthur," Silas said, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth as he slumped against the coal. Arthur Miller looked ahead. The bridge over the Hudson was out, a casualty of the same storm that had brought them together. The tracks simply ended in a jagged maw of darkness over the churning, icy water. The butcher didn't try to jump. He didn't try to save himself. He sat down in the coal, clutching his cleaver like a religious relic, and looked at the moon one last time. "Finally," Arthur whispered, "the debt is paid." The engine hit the gap at 95 miles per hour. For a heartbeat, there was silence, the sensation of flight. Then, the world exploded into steam, fire, and the crushing embrace of the river. The newspapers called it a freak mechanical failure. They talked about the heroism of the private investigator who managed to uncouple the passenger cars, saving 200 lives at the cost of his own. They found the remains of the engine at the bottom of the Hudson, buried in the silt. But they never found Silas Thorne. And they certainly never found Arthur Miller. Evelyn St. Clair walked away from the wreckage with nothing but a torn silk robe and a story that no one would ever believe. She moved to California, changed her name, and never stepped foot on a train again. As for me, I've looked at the manifests. I've read the secret reports from the railroad investigators. They found something odd in the wreckage of the dining car. It wasn't just blood. It was a set of surgical tools that didn't belong to any butcher or any chef. You see, the deep state loves a good cover story. A madman on a train is a perfect distraction when you're actually testing how people react to extreme terror in a closed environment. Silas thought he was fighting his past. Arthur thought he was getting revenge. But in the end, they were both just cargo.